All right, so we're closing out our series today, The Chosen People, bringing it all to a close. I hope you've had a good time in this series. I hope it's been a blessing to you and an inspiration to you. It certainly was a blessing to me to have the opportunity to dive in to this particular topic. I feel so blessed to be at a church where I can simply pray and ask our God, hey, where do you want me to go, Lord? And so often, just I don't know, it's hard to explain. It's cool. Go this way. So I think it's very cool that I got to do this, and I get to be at a place that allows me to do that. So thank you, Pilgrim. As we close out this series, I want to highlight a couple of things that are some realities. We're going to look at first the French Revolution. That's right. The French Revolution began in 1789 with the aim of overthrowing the oppressive monarchy and establishing a more egalitarian society. However, as the revolution progressed, the revolutionary leaders themselves became increasingly authoritarian and oppressive. A reign of terror led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, okay? Then the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the oppressive Tsarist regime in Russia in 1917, promising a more just and equal society. However, under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union descended into totalitarian state in which millions of people would be persecuted, millions would die, and this would be the new promise, right? Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, came to power in Cambodia in 1975 after overthrowing the U.S.-backed government, initially presenting themselves as liberators from oppression. However, as their radical communist policies took over, the death toll estimated and rose up to 1.7 million. South Africa. During apartheid in South Africa, the black majority of that population greatly oppressed by white South Africans for the longest. If you've kind of kept your thumb on the pulse of what's happening over to farmers in South Africa, that's now flipping in South Africa, okay? Israel-Palestine, of course, we've been looking at that for weeks and weeks and weeks, and hopefully you're getting the point that this is an ongoing thing from one side to the other, and back again, okay? What about like Nazi Germany, right? The Nazis looked at this whole situation after World War I as a form of oppression by the Jews and undermining their economy, undermining the military effort, and everything else within German society, their culture, their country, their livelihood, and so on. So you see a group that saw themselves as being oppressed at the end of World War I, rise to power, and then become the oppressors, okay, in World War II. And then, of course, how about our own country is interesting. Here's an interesting dynamic. We were fleeing persecution, looking for religious liberty, trying to get away from tyranny. But in several ways, you could argue we were also tyrannical, almost from the beginning, of people that we then oppressed here. As hard as that is to chew, just, there it is, right? That's reality. Now, here's what's interesting. We then fight a revolution. Now, what's that revolution about? That revolution was like, in part, not totally, but in part, like no taxation, like no representation without taxation, taxation without representation. There it is, nailed it. And so this whole idea of like being ruled by a foreign power. So we fight the Revolutionary War, right? Now think about that idea with taxes. These people, right before the Revolutionary War, around 1776, the tax rate for the average American citizen at that point, or would-be American citizen, was 1 to 1.5%. And we fought a war for it, right? Now think about, okay, so we were oppressed as a country. As I pointed out, we had fled, we got away from oppression. Then we were, in some aspects of our society, were the oppressors. And then we fought a war over being oppressed. Do you realize today, most likely the company you work for is taxed. The paycheck they give you is taxed, right? Let's see. If you buy something, that's taxed. After you've accumulated enough assets, those are taxed. And then after you die, if you want to give anything to anyone, because, hey, you're not here anymore, that's taxed. Right? Bring back England. Let's try this again. 1.5% doesn't sound so bad. So this is all I wanted to highlight as we start things off today, is that the oppressed becomes the oppressor. And then once that cycle happens over and over and over and over again, I promise you, what I just tried to give you a picture of is different societies, different cultures, different times, different eras, different continents. Believe it or not, most likely when you see something as being, it started here, other than Adam and Eve, usually we are able to go, you know what, like whenever you think something started, many times it's just where we arbitrarily pick the timeline to start in our analysis. You will find, like I hope we're beginning to discover throughout this series, is how far back the cyclical nature of an oppressor becoming the oppressed. And then once you're oppressed, you become the oppressor. And then once you're the oppressor for a while, then you become the oppressed. It's cyclical. It's crazy. And if you look into the history of civilization, it is an ongoing thing. And within that, there's a bunch of sub kind of things that are going on. Like everyone kind of loses their humanity to some degree. The person that's the oppressor has kind of lost their humanity because they're not seeing all that is around them as being human. At the same time, the oppressed has kind of lost their identity because they see themselves as nothing more than what they're told they are. And once everyone assumes beyond that, even the identity, with that then becomes worth, value, purpose, meaning. This is why, like, the children of Israel were such a mess. This is why they had to have a new identity, a name, a purpose, because this was hardwired into their thinking. And usually through a whole lot of different methodologies throughout time, sometimes it's just absolute bloodshed, okay, where all of a sudden those that are being oppressed become the oppressors. Sometimes, like you see in modern day times, look at the state of America, okay? You can consider, even if you were to push it to common times, like race relations within America. You can begin to understand that whether it's methodology of gaslighting just on social media, right? Guilt and shame tactics of how people see themselves or see their value, whether it even becomes something that's legislated to one degree or another, okay? And we took just a little bit of a snapshot of that just in the last couple of weeks. It could even be done institutionally, the way it's woven into an institution that begins to tip the scale. And even when something starts to get equal, what's interesting is if human behavior teaches us anything, it's that even when the scales start to get tipped, it is human nature to then oppress. Why? It's what human beings do. It's who we are. We are not at the top of the food chain because of our civility. We are at the top of the food chain because this is what we do. And if you dig into the depths of the cyclical nature of this, all people groups do this, have done it. So what do you do with that? Because partly I want to give you the picture of that's what's happening and continues to happen over and over and over again. And what does a society and a world look like, or a whole region for that matter, where Jesus is virtually at least seen by the people as a virtual non-factor in their society and culture and thinking and value system? What do you do when he's pulled out of something? And how do you ever trip this up or stop it? I thought it would be pretty cool to take a look at the life and the times of Joseph. I'm going to read a fair amount to you, but also I'm going to try to just summarize. Joseph's story in Genesis is really rare because so much of like creation and snapshots throughout much of Genesis that covers hundreds of years can just be like a handful of pages. And then everything just like stops for this one dude for like 12 chapters, which is a complete break from what's even happening in Genesis up to that. It's fascinating that God's word would do that. They really want us to look at this one guy in history and what can we take from that. We're going to pick the story up in Genesis chapter 37. Joseph is a different dude. His dad loves him more than his other brothers. I mean, just kind of, they have a kinship. He's one of the youngest, you know. It says he's good looking. If Scripture says you're good looking, you know, you're probably good looking, right? Smart, got, you know, a certain kind of charisma to him, whatever it may be. And he's being entrusted with already some leadership responsibilities and whatnot, but there's deep-rooted anger, okay, and hatred for him. And let's pick it up in Genesis 37. It says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. To fast forward, his brothers see Joseph showing up in his good-looking robe, and when it's all said and done, they plot and scheme like super quick to throw him into a pit. They want to get rid of him. And they're now trying to figure out, okay, we've taken this drastic step. What do we do now? Do we make it look like he was mauled to death, you know, by some wild animal? What are we going to do? And that's when the conversation picks up in verses 22 through 27. Here's verse 22. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So there's one brother, Reuben, okay? There's 12 of them total. And of this, the 10 older ones are like, "Oh, you know, this is Reuben's idea. Reuben's got kind of a plan. I'm going to get him out of it. But first, you know, this is what we'll make it look like." Here came verse 25. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Okay? And then here's verse 26. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. You got to love Judah. He's like, you know, let's be classy. Let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery, you know? Good idea, brother. So what's interesting, now catch this, they're in the land of Canaan. Where's the land of Canaan? Right? It's the very region we have been talking about for weeks. You're going to see a reference to Egypt. Egypt's Egypt, right? Same region, same area that we've been looking at for several weeks. Then you see the Ishmaelites. What are the Ishmaelites? Descendants of Ishmael, right? And as we looked at Muhammad and that whole story, what that looked like, the least favored, in fact, the exiled son of the servant girl, Hagar, kicked out into the wilderness, right? Well, they're growing and they're expanding. They know of each other, but like Scripture would say, they don't hang out. They don't really care for each other. But there they come, the Ishmaelites, right? And this would now be the descendants of Isaac and that whole story. So you see now even all of those decisions where these different religions are tied in, they all of this, even the region, it all starts to converge in this one particular story. And so they sell them. Now what's interesting is, and I'm just kind of hit you high level, once he's sold into slavery, God's hand is on him. He starts to rise to a position of authority, even within the jail, gets kind of a nice position at some point. Beyond that, then, he's falsely accused of something, of going after Potiphar's wife, which isn't true. In fact, Potiphar's wife was chasing him down. When it's all said and done, for Potiphar to save face, he throws him back into jail. Now he's back in the bottom of it all. He rises back up. There's this critical moment where Pharaoh is having dreams. No one can interpret them. Joseph has this ability. At this point, he's grown tremendously in wisdom and maturity and stature, and he knows who is the one holding all things in the palm of his hand. He knows that's God. He knows that's his Lord. And so he doesn't hold back from that in these exchanges with Pharaoh. He lets Pharaoh know, like, I'm not the one that can interpret dreams. This all comes from God. And he rightly interprets the dream to Pharaoh. And he helps Pharaoh understand there's a serious famine coming, okay? And then lifts up like this suggestion of what they could do. When it's all said and done, Pharaoh's so blown away, so impressed, he promotes him. It's the promotion of promotions. The guy was in a prison cell like 24 hours earlier, and now he's just getting hooked up like you wouldn't believe. And at this point, we're decades or a decade plus, whatever, probably decades removed from what his brothers did to him as a teenager. He's not a teenager anymore. He's a man, okay? Grown man. And probably within 12 hours or less, he's now like a big deal because he's already foretold the dream to Pharaoh, and he's given the strategy. And oh, by the way, through all of his ups and downs, God has equipped him with the skills, gifts, abilities, and experiences of understanding all of the different levels of society. He's been at the bottom, he's been in the middle, now he's at the top. So here's what his promotion sound like from Genesis 41. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Before the years of famine came, the two sons born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it is because God made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So what did I just share with you? He gets this incredible, promotion. And then we fast forward to, here he is. He's now married. He's got kids in verses 50 to 52. And here's what he does. Enough time has gone by. He's convinced he's good. Have you ever done that? Have you had something that just really tore your life up, or a person, or a situation, or experience? And man, it just about destroyed you. And time has gone by, and maybe you've prayed about it, and maybe all kinds of, you feel like you've healed. And so much so that maybe you even go to the level of like Joseph. What did he do? His firstborn is Manasseh, because God has made me forget all my trouble in my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Translation, I'm good. right? Like, instead of a tattoo that's like healed, he has 2 kids, and he gives the kids names inspired by what God has done in his life. And for lack of a better way of saying it, he's better. And that all happens until Joseph's estranged family, because pretty soon everyone's running out of food. There's only one nation that thought about how to store up grain and how to do everything else. They're becoming very quickly like the landowners, the only powerful, rich mover and shaker nation group of people, because no one else was prepared for the famine that was going to hit. And now Joseph's estranged family is getting hungry. And so through a whole series of events, a lot of give and take, Joseph is now testing his brothers who don't recognize him. And at one point, he has a few of them held in custody. Joseph's so smart. He's now got his brothers back in his presence. His brothers have no idea who he is. He hasn't seen them since they last threw him in a pit, ignored his cries for help, and let some other tribe just carry him off into slavery. He could be dead for all they knew. Joseph, being so smart, he's standing next to an interpreter. So his brothers are assuming that Joseph doesn't speak their native language. Joseph does. So he's standing there, if you can imagine, with them tied up, like he's just clueless, but he's listening to every word they're saying. Here's what happens in Genesis 42 in the dialogue between his brothers. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Why is he weeping? I thought he's good. I thought he's got 2 kids. Basically saying, I'm good. Like, what? Why is he crying? How about this? Genesis 43. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his younger brother, right? The one he was really connected to. It's the only younger brother he had, Benjamin. He hasn't seen his younger brother this entire time. All these years, right? It says, as he looked and he saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, "Is this your younger brother, the one you told me about?" And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. After he had washed his face, he came out and, controlling himself, said, "Serve the food." So all I'm trying to tell you is, number one, on a practical level, especially if you've been through something where you were the victim of something on one level, shape, or form, how dehumanizing that can feel, or how powerless that can feel. What a terrible, icky, just everything, what it does to us, the struggles that it creates, the memories that it creates, the questions, the unanswered questions. And you go through this whole path and you think, man, I'm finally over it, I'm finally good. And then this thing walks back into your life, or it's a memory, it's a song, it's a place, it's a street name, who knows, whatever it could possibly be, it's suddenly right there. And just like Joseph, this is one of the things I love about his story, is how honest and real and gritty it is. He's driven back to tears, because it's all coming back to him. And I don't know if that's so much about whether he's healed or not healed. I think it's about just the messiness sometimes of being a broken human in this life. And sometimes when we're convinced we're strong, sometimes when we're convinced we're completely over it, maybe to a lesser degree or not, part of us is broken. There are scars you have, as sure as you're hearing my voice, and you may have for the rest of your life. And that's what's being touched on in this story, and it's very honest and real. There's a critical moment. Judah, one of his brothers, Judah, the one who made the suggestion, let's not kill him, let's just sell him off into slavery decades before. Judah shows some level of a conscience. The way things escalated is Joseph convinces them that the youngest brother, the one brother that their father didn't want them all to lose, Benjamin, don't lose Benjamin. The father's like, I can't bear it, okay? And Joseph, knowing that whole backstory and everything else, convinces his brothers, I'm going to put this younger brother, Benjamin, into slavery. He's mine. And the whole way that escalated is awesome. You got to check it out. And Judah, at some point, now speaks up. And this is what Judah says. He says in Genesis 44, 33 and 34, he says, now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. Translation, let me take his place. I can't go back home without Benjamin. In fact, I would rather Benjamin go home before me. Now, the power of that statement, when the person who's delivering it was the one who so easily sold you off into slavery. That conflict of emotions, right? Well, why didn't you do that for me decades earlier? Where was that conscience back then? But then the beauty of like, wow, you would do that for our younger brother? Like, you know? I mean, it just had to all be happening. Like, what a mess, right? And this is how he describes it in Genesis 45. This is what happens next. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. To save lives. Now, what happens there? In light of everything I told you about at the very beginning of this message, of most civilizations and most nations and most people groups, from its race or ethnicity or religion or what have you, and how the cyclical nature of what people do. Did you just catch what Joseph did? That whole idea of humanity being lost in both the oppressor and the oppressed. And this whole collision, and normally we aren't able to resolve it as human beings. That's why it's cyclical. What does he do? He has his foot on the neck of his brothers. It has finally come full circle. This is his chance to repay evil with evil. Right now, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Here we go. And he introduces a glitch in the matrix. He does the only thing that restores humanity: purpose, meaning, value, hope. He forgives. He forgives. It's the only thing that stops insanity and generational cruelty and insanity. And I know, just probably like you watching this, that's a really hard pill even for me to accept at times. There's very little in my being that wants to do that, forgive. And that's exactly what he does. It's the power of forgiveness. It's so interesting because Joseph would do so many things that seem to be right in line with the character of the person of Jesus. And yet God would only use Joseph really to restore the line and the lineage of Judah, the one who wanted to sell him into slavery. Judah, who was a lousy father-in-law. Judah, who was a terrible father. Okay, God had to remove both of his sons. They were so evil. I mean, there's very little redeemable about Judah. There's one moment Judah did well. But if you look at the whole story of his life, what a train wreck dumpster fire, okay? It's through the line and lineage of Judah, this mess, that forgiveness would show up. Not just for a group of brothers, not for a generation, not between a nation, but between all creation and all people for all time. Forgiveness would be offered to all of mankind so that there would be quite literally peace between us and God. That's what Jesus would do and show up through the line and lineage of Judah. Jesus on the cross would be both the oppressed and yet carry the worst transgressions of the oppressor. He becomes the worst of all of it. The words of Jesus and the implications of Jesus isn't just about forcing us or telling us or commanding us to forgive. He does tell us to forgive. And that's because it'll rot our own hearts, our own souls. It's because any joy in life will completely be snatched away. It gives a foothold to Satan like no other. That's why he wants us to forgive. It's not a cruel joke. He wants human beings to have a heart that's soft and malleable, that sees things through the lens of God. And you can't see things through the lens of God whenever everything is mired in your worldview with hatred and malice. It's just not possible. So this is what Jesus would interject. And Joseph in that way would interject it in a very similar way. His whole family in this sense is then restored. Everyone gets to see themselves differently and their brother differently, and him to them. It wasn't that he wasn't hurting. Joseph isn't different than you and I. That's why he was weeping several times in the story. The memories were real. The pain was real. It's not about suck it up, cupcake, and move on. It's just about what does it mean to have an experience with God for the rest of your life that's meaningful, that's in the moment, that's a fresh breath of air, is a new chance and a new life, a new identity, a new purpose, new meaning. And that's what you see in that story. And that's ultimately what would play out with Jesus on the cross. And that gift that he would give you and that he would give me. There's nothing like Jesus. And in Jesus in your life and throughout this world and throughout the Middle East, it's about love, grace, mercy, pursuit, kindness, justice carried out on the cross for all of humanity. New purpose, new meaning, new identity, a forgiven child of God. Forgiveness. Let's pray.